So my name is Sierra Moxon. I'm one of the developers of LinkML. I work at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab under Chris Mungle, thankfully. He's a great leader and mentor and the developer of a lot of these tools, amongst all of his other jobs. So it's really great to work with him. I wanted to put this slide up for a few minutes because importantly, it has a QR code that you can use to get to these slides. I'll also put a link to them in the chat here. Oh, she's got it already. Thank you, Sarah. And then a link to the Google Drive that we're using. And it's just kind of a nice thing to have because we will have a lot of links in this presentation that you might want to go back to, or if you want to take a look at the data that we're going to use to model and make this tutorial happen, it's all in that Google Drive. So I'll keep that up for just a second so everybody can jump in if they want to. And go on. And so, yeah, like I said, I introduced myself. I'm Sierra, and I'm joined by a couple, 3 or 4 really important people in our world. We have Kevin Shaper. He is a software developer, a very talented software developer in many different fields, including being the technical manager of Monarch Initiative, working on their knowledge graph, as well as the COSA knowledge graph framework, and a ton of other things that he's always my go-to when I have a question about setting up a new architecture. And we have Corey Cox, another very talented software engineer from the Monarch Initiative, who works on a lot of different projects to bring data together. He also has a background in biology, and that makes him very helpful and one of those rare people that can do both the biology and the computer science. And our wonderful organizer and leader, project manager, Sarah Gierke, she's here to help us make sure we have our ducks in a row. All of us are here to answer your questions. We said it sort of early on, but if you can put them in the chat or raise your hand or just interrupt us, we're happy to answer those questions. So I kind of already shared this slide, but I just want to make sure everyone has it. There's our Google Drive. Here are the slides. There's a QR code. And we actually have, if you want a spoiler alert, a GitHub repository that goes over everything we're going to cover in the tutorial today. If you want to check it out, that's where we're going to end up. That's the end point of this tutorial. Okay, so I think you all should have probably gotten an email from one of us that had software prerequisites for this tutorial. They're not hard to set up, but they do take a bit of time, especially if you're on an operating system that none of us work with, Windows. But it does work. I've had some success in the past getting it set up on Windows as well. So, and that's a lot of thanks to David Linke, one of our open source developers who also works on Windows. And he spent a lot of time and a lot of effort getting this going. So thanks to him. I just want to keep this on the screen just for a few minutes to make sure everybody can get started on that while I yammer on about the framework, just so we can all start at the same place. So we put this out in the agenda as well, but really we're trying to teach people how to build LinkML schema repositories in this tutorial. Importantly for this audience, we know that ontologies are your bread and butter and that you love them and you develop them and you want to use them, and so do we. LinkML is really attached to ontologies. We like to reuse the definitions that are already done in ontology space. We like to map to ontologies. We like to subset ontologies. We like to use them in every facet of our development. And so it's a really great place to see ontologies in actions. And then we want to show you that you can validate data against our schemas using tools from the LinkML framework and programmatically access your schemas if you're a developer and you want to do more complicated navigation of data and schemas together. We're going to show you how to do that. And then maybe just introduce briefly how you can transform a schema or transform your data from one schematic representation into another using LinkML map. And before we get started, I hope a lot of you see your face on this screen. We are an open source project. The vast majority of our developers are volunteers. We work because we love this, and I think we're at a really amazing time of data management for all the other stuff that's going on in the world that's not so amazing. We finally have tooling, and we have funding a little bit to help us make the really high aims of fair data management something that could be a reality. And I just wanted to say thank you to all of our open source developers that help make that possible. A special thanks to Leo Baumgart for providing some plant tissue schema examples that we'll use in this tutorial. He's very excited in making LinkML and was gracious enough to let us use the schema that he developed in a spreadsheet to feed this tutorial. And just like every other project and every other presentation, we do try to approach all of our users with empathy and welcoming and inclusive language, and be respectful of everyone's different viewpoints and expertise. And we just ask you to do the same. So here is our agenda for today. I'm going to give a brief introduction and help you set up a LinkML repository in your own workspace. I'm going to talk a little bit about authoring a LinkML model and all the different components that go into it. We'll have a short break. We'll come back and show how LinkML can validate data and then generate different kinds of serializations, is what we call them, of your model. So we'll be writing in YAML that will be able to produce a schema in JSON schema or in OWL, and then show you how we automatically generate our documentation. We'll probably take another break, depending on how long I talk here. Gotta keep moving. And then we'll get to the good stuff from Kevin to look at how you programmatically access your schema and how you could develop tools around accessing the schema and the data together. And finally, from Corey, we'll talk about LinkML map and introduce you to that package and the working group behind it. He leads that, and then hopefully have some discussion at the end. We'll see. It's a lot to get through. Just one last time, here's those software prerequisites. Hopefully you can put them in place while I'm talking. So I think the first thing we're going to do is just sort of introduce LinkML for those of you that are new to our repository and our package. And to do that, I wanted to sort of start with this Slido, which is just a oh gosh, I'm forgetting the name of it. It's like a poll. It's a poll. That's what it is. So if you could click on that link, and maybe Sarah could share it in the chat. And then we'll go to the poll. The first question I have here is just, here, maybe I can get it like this. What's your primary background? Are you a biologist? Are you an ontology developer? Probably you're both. Are you a software engineer? Do you handle data systems science? Are you a curator? Do you annotate with ontologies? Or do you just do a little bit of everything? Awesome. Looks like so far we have a good half and half mix. That's terrific.
I love that this is animated.
Yeah, just you wait. There's a word cloud. It's going to be a fun tutorial. It's great to see that we're a little bit of everything and a mixture of life sciences and biology and software engineering. I think that's sort of the prime spot for LinkML. I think we all have something to contribute there in this framework. Okay, so I think what we all know is that if data looked like it did on the left side of my screen here with clearly labeled attributes and whole numbers, and for goodness sakes, can we just use integers to represent data, then we'd all have less work to do. And it would be easy to compare and reuse our data. But unfortunately, or fortunately, biology seems to be the science of exceptions. And we have very detailed information all the way down in the cell and genetics level, that is complex and it's contextual and it changes as the biological system changes. And we have all different kinds of organisms, and all different kinds of genetic basis for development and genetic basis for disease states. And a lot of the projects that we work on are trying to bring data from multiple different domains together in a single platform to find insights. And most of our data, although we do have a lot of really good resources now that provide structured data, but a lot of our data in our domain is still unstructured in the form of literature, figures, lab notebooks, and everyone's favorite spreadsheet. And so as a data modeler, what I usually see as the first step of my job is some sort of spreadsheet. And depending on who you're working with or the level of expertise or the level of time people have to record their data, you can get all sorts of different things. And so oftentimes we see unreliable identifiers or identifiers that are made specifically for a project and can't be linked anywhere except for that project. The headers maybe don't have enough descriptions or metadata in them to tell us what goes in the columns. in particular, if a value is missing, is that intentional or is it a mistake? We don't know necessarily how to, validate data that's entered into a spreadsheet or into an unvalidated table sort of situation. And so we can get different values for units, different values for a particular column, depending on who's taking the data in. And so it's kind of unpredictable and it requires a human to look at. And of course, that's not the only spreadsheet, right? We can also have colorful spreadsheets and transposed spreadsheets where, it looks like each row here in the spreadsheet is actually probably some sort of column or maybe even a class in our data model. We can have syntax specifics, right? So we could have different kinds of syntaxes that mean actions of different kinds, depending on how we interpret those syntaxes. And sometimes spreadsheets are really great. They can actually already start assigning ontology terms to the representation that they have, but you kind of have to interpret that as a human. And sometimes they have really detailed examples, which is kind of one of the ones we're going to look at today, but it has not only the kinds of schema definitions we need, but examples of what they mean here and definitions. But none of this is sort of validatable without some tooling around it. And I'll tell you that there are, generalist data repositories out there. One of them that I like very much is Dryad. You can submit data from a paper there. You can upload your data in basically a zip file, and it's up to you to describe that data for someone else to use. And this is a lot of actually really good information, but again, it's not computable. And oftentimes the links inside of these manifests don't actually go to the place that they're saying, or they're dead links. And so we really have a way to go in making data more shareable, right, by a computer and not just by a human. And sometimes what we see is even if you have a framework that is more complex than a spreadsheet, right, if you have two Postgres databases, for example, they can have different schemas and you can see those schemas, but if they have the same parameter with totally different data types, in this case, I'm looking at whatever environment is, it's a character string, and over here in this database, the environment, the same string and the same kind of sample table has a foreign key, I already know that I'm going to have to do something here as a human to interpret that. And it's not just a made up example. One of the data models that I worked on was the Alliance of Genome Resources coming together and bringing together model organism database schemas. 3 different schemas had what we considered a genotype. One of them called them a fish, one of them called them a GDP genotype, and one of them just called it a genotype prop or a genotype. And all of those had different columns and values, and it was our job to sort of bring those together. And our job is doubly complex because we don't just have Postgres and spreadsheets, we have all sorts of things. And, it really depends on the hat you wear and what kind of research you're doing to employ what kind of technologies that you're familiar with. And the technology you're familiar with is not necessarily the easiest format for others to reuse. And there's a learning curve to all these stacks. And under the hood, technology evolves too, just like biology. And so often the technology evolves right out from under the application that was using it. And so we always have to keep in mind that the insights across our data sources that we're trying hard to find are really at the intersection of all of these different things. And so we want to make the learning curve for technologies easier so that we can keep our eyes focused on the hard work of finding those insights. Right. So what can we do differently? We shouldn't just complain, we should fix it. And I think, as this group knows, the best way to start is with ontologies. We want to reuse and contribute to existing ontologies whenever possible, right? We have enough ontologies, we just need to improve the ones we have and make the selection of terms from an ontology really easy. And I'll start there. I think this is a very practical approach to using ontologies and telling people how to use ontologies. The second part of my talk, I'll just go into what I mean by making implicit models explicit with LinkML. So I will wave my hands and say that I'm mostly a software engineer. And so this is a made up example, but it's helpful to explain what I mean by using ontologies, which I won't have to spend too much time on with this group, but I will do it anyway to get us all centered in the same kind of discussion here. But these are 3 different researchers taking water samples from places in Oregon. The one on the left is Lake Abert, the middle is Pacific Ocean, and the far right is Crater Lake. And a 4th researcher comes along and says, I really want to compare the microbiotic compositions of these waters across Oregon. Can I do that with these 3 data sets? And in fact, that's not just what I want to do. I really want to be more specific. I want to look at the epipelagic zones, which is, the zone of water that is exposed to light. And, I also am really interested in the salt composition of the water. And the first thing this person would have to do really would be to translate the title of these data sets, the names of these spreadsheets, into some sort of representation of whether or not these are, lakes or oceans or what they are. And in fact, probably in order to do that, they'd want to use something like the ENVO ontology, right? Because we've already defined what a lake is. We don't want to ask the question over and over, is a puddle a lake? Is the backyard swimming pool a lake? Like, what's a lake? We want to use those controlled vocabularies that people have spent time and effort defining to define our samples too. And if we look in ENVO, we can even see that someone has decided to make a term about the marine photic zone, which is the epipelagic zone that we're looking for. And so if we had tagged these particular depth measurements as a marine photic zone, we'd have a lot easier time pulling that data out of this data set. And we can do that all the time. We can help people use ontologies that way. I think the other half of this, though, is that these spreadsheets are models. They're just not computable, right? And so the other thing is, like, we have objects and classes in these spreadsheets, but we need to make them machine readable. And I think the other thing we have to remember is that choosing terms from ontologies for users can be very difficult and overwhelming. And I'll give you a little bit of an example of that in a minute. But the other half of this is turning those spreadsheets into actual schemas. And the way we do that in our group is with LinkML. LinkML is a two-part toolkit. On the left, we see that LinkML has a modeling language that we use to describe all the elements in our schema. We'll get into that in particular in the tutorial. And on the right, we see that LinkML is also a programmatic toolkit that helps you validate data, convert data from one serialization or schema to another. We have auxiliary tools that help you do data entry and make inference across your schema as well. So this is just an example using our same model and expanding out the spreadsheet just a little bit. We've turned that into what we consider a LinkML model. At the top, you can see that immediately LinkML really explicitly wants to reuse models as much as possible. So you can import one model in LinkML syntax into another LinkML syntax. And in fact, most, if not all LinkML models import the LinkML types schema as a baseline here. We also are able to provide really, human readable, simple descriptions for every single element in our schema. Something you can't do out of the box with Postgres. You can do it with JSON schema, but in LinkML, you can also describe hierarchy of classes, which you can't do in JSON schema. We can reuse existing class definitions from ontologies. This slot URI spot that I'm talking about right here is basically literally making the attribute depth, the URI for that in the OWL serialization be the ENVO class. Alternatively, if you want to define salinity with more details that are in Pato, you can do that in LinkML, but also establish a direct or exact mapping to the Pato term for salinity. This helps people interpret your data as compared to some other data that might use Pato as the definition of salinity as well. I'm not sure if you would do that, but you can imagine cases where you would. Again, this is just an example. We can also constrain the content of a particular file. So instead of just saying that for sample type, we want to use an ENVO term, we can actually say it must be an ENVO term from this ENVO ontology. And we can go into detail about how we restrict that even further as we go on. And I just want to give you an example of doing this in the real world. The National Microbiome Data Collaborative, one of the projects I worked on, works with the Genomic Standards Consortium to apply terms to their environmental package, where, if you have a particular biosample and you want to describe the environment with which you sampled it from, you kind of use a combination of 3 terms from MixS to describe that. You describe the broad scale environmental system with which you took that sample. You also describe the medium or the kind of data, the kind of thing that you took it from, be it soil or water, et cetera, and then the local environment as well. And usually what the MixS standard is sort of says, go to ENVO and use a subclass of a particular term. So for the broad scale environmental term, we need to use a subclass of the biome term in ENVO. And this is really important. Like, we really want the standard in MixS to be flexible. There's absolutely times when ontologies need to change and grow. And so telling someone something very flexible about how to access the terms that are necessary for a particular field in a schema, it needs to grow along with those ontologies. But I think when you're down in the weeds, practically users get a little intimidated by looking at ontology browsers, and they would like just sort of a pick list in their user interface to find the kinds of terms, the subset of terms that you need. And what we did in NMDC is we made some LinkML enumerations or pick lists or subsets that we were able to apply to each of those ontology terms and turn them into pick lists in our user interface pretty easily. And of course, we had success there. So now we're doing a lot more with value sets or enumerations in LinkML, and Chris and others have put together a repository called LinkML Value Sets, which takes CDEs from the clinical world and turns them into LinkML enumerations. They're easy to import into schemas. They have a lot of annotation with them, so you can see, that this electron is, the description of it is right here with your model. It also has a meaning field, but I'll get into in the tutorial a little bit later. But it's another kind of way of mapping directly to an ontology term, and you can add extra metadata to make it easier to use that enumeration. I encourage people that are interested in that kind of work to check out the value sets repository and get in touch with us, because we're actively developing it. All right, so back to our other half of the framework. We have a lot of languages. How do we talk to each other programmatically? LinkML also has a toolkit to convert schemas from YAML into all these different kinds of other kinds of serialization: OWL, Shackle, JSON schema, Python data classes, and Pydantic data classes, SQL, etc. And I think the only caveat I would give you from a real world point of view is that not every single component of the LinkML modeling language is supported in all these other frameworks. Sometimes there is a lossy transformation here. But the main parts are there, and we're constantly developing, we're constantly improving our generators to make it more comprehensive. And I think one of the underrated features of LinkML that I always like to highlight is that once you make a schema in LinkML and you use some of the tooling we have to generate your repository, which I'll show you how to do here, you can auto-generate your documentation from directly those fields in the model, the description I was showing you, the mappings, the way that classes are related to each other, their definitions, all of that, their mappings to ontology terms, all of that information in the schema, you just have to write once, and a simple GitHub action will deploy documentation for you. And there's tooling to help you customize that documentation. You can see on the left here, the NMDC documentation has different flavoring or different colors than the BioLink documentation in the middle. We also make schema diagrams that are clickable, so you can see the relationship between your classes. It's just a nice way to expose your model to more people and to really get the word out about your model as well. We'll talk about this in more depth, but you can take the LinkML schema and you can put some data towards it, and through a variety of processes. The default process is basically to turn that schema, that LinkML YAML, into JSON and validate using a JSON schema, but actually the LinkML validator is built in a plugin architecture thanks to some folks on the call here. I see you, Deepak. And so you can build plugins to that to make it validate either particular use cases you have for your project that aren't covered in the JSON schema validation or in any other validation in LinkML, but also you can make it work with different kinds of serialization, like an OWL validator, for example. There's lots of ways to write LinkML. You can, here's a spoiler alert, next community meeting for LinkML, I'm going to give a demo of how to draft LinkML schema with an LLM. And you'll be sad to know that you can do it in about 15 minutes, with which you took 2 hours to do in this tutorial with us today. But LLMs are really changing the way a lot of business is done. So of course, they're changing the way LinkML is drafted as well. But we also have tooling. So if you took an Excel spreadsheet schema and you ran it through Schema Automator, which is a LinkML tool, you could get a LinkML schema out the end. You can also turn JSON schemas into LinkML with Schema Automator. You can use a special tool we call schema sheets, which allows you to author your schema using a special syntax in a Google Sheet or an Excel spreadsheet. And you can write your schema in LinkML YAML, which is what we're going to do today. Okay, those are those prerequisites. Again, I'm almost done talking, so we're on time, thankfully. Hopefully you have those installed. And I guess now I think is a time for another question right before we start setting it up. So let me see if I can actually make this work somehow here. We should be switching to a new slide. Oh, I found it. All right, let's see, did this work? Maybe, of course not. Oh, I have to hit that button. Okay, there we go. What comes to mind when you hear the word schema? And this is a word cloud, so we won't see anything until you start typing. To me, it is a blueprint or an architecture details. I love that one. That's a great one. Framework, structure, blueprint, UML. UML, that's a good one too. Complex. No idea. Excellent. I love it. Organize. Yep. Blueprint. Absolutely. Chaos. A logical model diagram. That's right. Architecture. Data model. Yep. Limiting. There is a good one. Limiting probably in a bad way and limiting probably in a good way. Standards to organize chaos. Yeah. That's great. Yeah. And I think like, I would probably add the term, democratic, right? It's a way for all of us to communicate between our different domains, right? Sort of meet in the middle of that crazy world that is both software development and complex biology. Agreeing upon a standard can sometimes be very difficult, especially when you need to, produce a tool on top of that. But it can also be very helpful to communicate with. Okay, great. So let's get started. And after that, hopefully inspiring word cloud, we can come to the real world of software development in LinkML. And I think a lot of people probably who've worked with Python before know this XKCD comic where you have 6 million ways to install Python, 6 million ways to deal with your packages. How do you set up a virtual environment? It's a constant struggle, right? And all I'll say to that is, yes, it is. But we're trying to make that as easy as possible for people. There's a new kid in town called UV, and UV does the work of installing Python for you. It's also your package management system. It's also your package deployment system. If you want to put your LinkML schema on PyPI, it does that for you. It also makes virtual environments, so you're kind of isolated in a particular directory. It's really great. It's the newest kid in town, and maybe next week we'll have a new one for you. But for right now, UV is the lingua franca, for example. So I think what I want to do now is just start doing this interactively. And if you want to follow along, that's great. If you want to ask questions, that's great. So I'm just going to test whether or not my implementation has the things that I need. See if I can get enough space here so you can see both my screens. Probably can. All right, so I'm going to do UV -- version to see if I have UV installed. I have UV 097. I think that's one of the most recent versions. You might have a different version of UV. I think I've tested all the way from UV 6 to UV 9, and they all work about the same for me. If you don't have it, you can, and you're on a Mac or a Linux, you can use this curl command to install real quick. If you're on Windows, go ahead and go to that document and install for Windows. Let's see. All right, and now I'm going to just check my other installations. I'm going to check that I have Copier. I'll tell you what Copier is. Copier is a templating system that we use to help you get a LinkML repository that has all the bells and whistles that we're going to talk about. It's just a really easy way to start a repository that looks like all the other repositories. So if you have to ask questions about your particular instance, it's easier for us as developers to answer those questions because you have everything with it. If you don't have Copier, if you don't see this message, just go ahead and install it with UV. It's another benefit of UV. You can get Copier for free. If you don't have those two things, you can always read the docs here. And then the last tool that was part of our prerequisite was just. And just is, if you've ever used a make file before, which many of you probably haven't, it's just a way to make your commands simpler from the command line. And this is what I mean by the command line. It's just this terminal. And the benefit of just is that it's also helpful for Windows folks. It's much easier to use than make. We have different shells in Windows versus Linux or Mac. And so just makes it easier. So if you don't have it yet, you can, again, install it with UV, or you can go to the prerequisite page and install it separately. The last thing I'll do is ask you if you have your Git, local Git set up correctly. If you have a Git user account, we can push all of the work we do today up to your GitHub repository. If you don't, no worries, but that's how you set it up. And I already know I have mine set up, so I'm not going to reconfigure my global username and stuff. All right, so what is this thing we're going to run? It's called LinkML Project Copier. It's a project scaffold. It ensures that we have the right LinkML tools installed. It lets you do all of this work with just a simple command. And it gives you access to our GitHub actions that we run to generate those docs on GitHub pages. It gives you access to our validation tools. It gives you access to all of our generators that move the LinkML YAML into the different schema serializations. It's great. So what I'm going to ask us to do now is just to make a directory for our tutorial. Copy and paste from. Yeah, so here is the slides. I would encourage you just to copy and paste from the slides directly. If you don't have access, just put it in the chat. Sarah will give you access, but you should have access. And then you can just go to the slide itself and copy and paste. In fact, I might stop the presentation and do that myself, but let's see how far I can get. So make dir LinkML tutorial 2025. Oh, of course, because I already did it, huh? So don't do this, but I will. Okay. All right, so I've made that directory. I'm going to cd into it. So now I'm just, I'm in the directory that I just made, LinkML tutorial 2025. And then I'm going to run this really easy copier command. That's the templating system. And actually, I'm going to get out of, excuse me. Let me just exit out of there. So I'm going to do exactly what I was encouraging you to do and just copy and paste that whole command, including all the way up to this little period. This little period means do it in the directory I'm in. Which, syntax, right? It's always so obvious. So I'm going to copy and paste that into my terminal window, right in that tutorial name, and it's going to start coming up with an interactive prompt for me. And the first thing it's going to do is ask me what I want my project to be named. I always name my projects exactly what I've named the directory. So for us, it'll be LinkML tutorial 2025. For Python, it really likes to make directories that are deployable up to PyPI, so you can share your model with people who are importing from Python with underscores. So I would just leave the slug this way, make it into underscores and just leave it. Don't worry about it. My email address and my name. And I'll show you where all this information goes in a minute. And my GitHub handle is Sierra-Moxon. Now, if you're in an organization where you want to put this LinkML schema that you're making, write the organization name. So if I was in the Monarch Initiative, I would use Monarch Initiative because that's my GitHub organization name. But my personal user account is Sierra-Moxon, so I'm going to use that. You can change the description of the project all you want. It gives you a license to license your schema. We encourage you to use MIT. It's just very open source. Let anyone use anything you want, but you can always specify a different one if you have different requirements there. The year of the first release, 2025, let's sure hope so. And then it's going to ask you some questions. It's going to say, do you want an example schema, including the Python generated component of your model and some tests? I always encourage people to say yes. It's just a nice way to get started. You always want the GitHub actions. You want this to be as automated as possible. You always want to do a documentation preview so that you can see if you've made changes to your schema, how it shows up to the rest of the world. So yes, the default is no, my bad. That's okay. We can fix it. Don't you worry. And so if it happens successfully, you should see a lot of green in your terminal that says it created. And if I do an ls, which means directory listing, I think in Windows, I learned last week, is dir. You can see what the copier template did. It made all sorts of stuff for us here. It made a code of conduct, a contributing document. It made the project and the source directory. It made all sorts of stuff for us, which is great. That means it worked. So I'll just pause there and see if everyone is following along. If you're not, speak up. It's okay. Yeah, and so I'll just talk while people are getting brave to speak up if it's not working for you, but it created...
Sierra, someone had some issues with the Jinja extensions.
The Jinja extension, okay. So this one, it didn't work for you? Or maybe you got it fixed. This one should... Okay, cool. All right, yeah, so just run that one and it will add the Jinja extension, and then make sure you've got just installed too. And then here we are with this. And what this really is doing for you is it's creating a virtual environment. So sometimes people would understand a Python virtual environment with something like venv or venv, or a virtual env, or some other kind of Python ecosystem setup. But what it does with UV is creates it directly in the directory we're installed in, takes care of the path for you. Like I said, it adds all of our project requirements. It's just a really nice way of getting you started with a simple command. And then the last step we need to take here is just to set up the project. So we're going to use that tool we installed called Just. It's our build and command runner. This setup is going to initialize the project in Git, make it really easy for you to push that up to GitHub. So I'm going to run mine. Let's see if it worked. What this is doing is it's installing the virtual environment. You can kind of see that it's creating that virtual environment. It added all of the requirements of LinkML. It initialized, oops, let's go back up. It initialized it as a Git project. And now it's using the test schema that it made. So still it's doing everything for us. It made a schema and it's running some of our LinkML commands on that. It's running the Pydantic serialization, it's running the Java serialization, it's running the YAML serialization, and it's generating doc for us. So it's doing a whole bunch of stuff. And if that MIT is the license you should use, if you just want the default, you can just push return on the MIT license and it'll select that for you. And so, you've created a bunch of stuff here, and that's terrific. I think my favorite thing to do to test this is to run just test doc. And this isn't in the tutorial. I just want to show you really quick what it looks like. It's going to go and run your documentation for your schema locally for you. And then what we can see almost immediately is that it has created an online documentation about this schema that it auto-generated, right? And so the schema we're going to look at that it auto-generated for us has 3 classes. They're not important. They're just an example, but they do show that we already have, a nice schema doc waiting for us to review. Okay, I'm getting from just setup, get init cannot be run because not with this, the shell. Okay, that's a very good point. Let me show you how to fix that one. Let me get out of here. All right, so I'm assuming you're on Windows. I am gonna stop sharing really quick and start sharing my PyCharm environment. There is a file that just created for you called the just file. Hold on one sec, let me bring it up here. Okay, and you're seeing a different screen of mine. Mine is a integrative development environment called PyCharm. I'll show you another way to do this in a second if you don't have a development environment, but there's this tool called just file. And in the just file, right here on the top, there is a little tiny hashtag that you need to remove. And that's going to tell your just setup to use the Windows shell instead of what we think of as the Unix shell. So I think, let me just look at the chat one more time. Yeah, so let's try that. And if you can unset this command, that will help. And then rerun, let me share again. Terminal and those ones again. So if you then, once you've set that in your just file, so another way to look at that is more just file, right? So if you have it unset so that it can recognize it, then try running your command again, just setup. Hopefully it will, oh, great, terrific. All right, so it's working. All right, so if you're on Windows, go ahead and unset that and you should be good to go. All right, so now we have a project. Hopefully you're able to do that. If you want a bonus here, you know, I'll show you really quick how to do it. Here I am in my GitHub account, Sierra Moxon, and my intention here is to push what we just did. We just made a repository. I want to push it up to my organization. So I'll show you how to do that really quick. I'm going to make a new repository in my organization called LinkML. You guessed it, tutorial 2025. And I'm not going to do anything else. That's all I want to do. I'm going to just create the repository and it's going to give me some commands, which are very helpful. Thank you, Git. I'm going to copy and paste them here. I'm not going to worry too much about what they do. I will tell you what they do if you want me to, but it's just easier just to copy them. It'll take less time. And what it's going to do now is it's going to push my LinkML tutorial up to GitHub and start doing some awesome things for us because of our project setup. It's going to start building and testing our repository, and it's deploying our docs. So this is going to be great because we're going to have GitHub pages up in just a few minutes with our setup. So while that's running, we'll go back to our tutorial.
Sierra, there are a couple
okay,
troubleshooting questions in the chat if you want to take a look.
Okay. Do we need to change the path when uncommenting that line? No, I don't think so. I'm getting the build back and return error. The hatchling. Emma is on Windows, is that right? No, maybe not. Emma, are you on Mac OS and you're getting that call to hatchling? And which command was that had that problem? I have not seen that one, so setup, just setup have that problem, okay? And you have UV installed, yes? Okay, can you look at your, let's look at your a file called pyproject.toml, and it should have been created for you, but let's look at if we do this, if we do UV build, can you run on your site, Emma, can you run UV build and see if you have anything similar to this? So, oh, Windows. Okay. Just failed to build is all you get, huh? Yeah, so to me, so Sandra, I want you to look and see if you do have that YAML file in the path that it's requesting and if it has permissions that are accessible to you, like if it has sort of read, write, and execute permissions on that, not necessarily execute, but read, write permissions on the YAML file. And to me, Emma, I think your UV install, there must have been another error in there somewhere. You can try a rebuild here. I'll put a command in the chat. Let's see if that helps. I'm not exactly sure. Maybe while I go on, maybe if Kevin or Corey are on the call, you could maybe try a few things with Emma to get her going. And Sandra, I think we have a path problem on Windows. So you are in. Yeah. It's saying it can't find your YAML file. When you did it, did you allow it to create the test schema for you? Okay, so let's let me see. So I will show you on LinkML tutorial 2025. If you get the cheat sheet, Sandra. So if you go to this particular repo, you'll be able to find the YAML file that we end up with. If you can copy and paste that to the location that's expecting it and try just setup again and tell me what happens, that would be great. I think probably in the when you were interacting with just and setting up your project, there is one question in there that says, do you want me to create a test schema? And sometimes if you write no to that, it doesn't create any file whatsoever, and then just setup doesn't work because it doesn't have the file. So let's try just putting it in there. Yeah, exactly. And we'll put it in there and see what happens. Caveat, you're going to get all the end answers to this tutorial. So just, that's okay. You'll just get all of the stuff we modeled today. Anyway, okay. So let's look a little bit at our directory structure. This is where I say, if you have an integrative development environment like PyCharm, it's much easier to look at than on the command line. I am going to sort of look at the project structure in my IDE here, just to explain it a little bit more easy for myself, but you can always look at it with LS or dir as you see fit. But what happens when this works successfully, and I'm really glad that people are actually trying it, and if you haven't, it's okay, but it'll make all of these directories for us. And some of the most important ones that we're going to go over today are the SRC directory, which is the source. It's the source of our code. It's the source of our schema. It's basically the home base of what we're going to be editing. And under schema, we're going to have what looks like LinkML. That's because it is LinkML, and it's going to have created this for us. For Sandra, she's going to have the whole schema. For folks that have followed along and done it through the default, you're going to have 3. Oh, excellent. I'm running just setup. Karina did. Okay. Yeah. So again, Karina, I think you might. It's because your shell, the shell you're using, that command is not part of the shell. I've seen that before on Windows. That's why we sort of uncommented that line in the just file. If you're getting that, it looks like you're on Linux or Mac OS. If you're getting that anyway, I would definitely not uncomment that. You want to use your default shell, and then, okay, there you go. Maybe Kevin will respond. I'm going to keep going here. So this tutorial, the YAML file is here in source. Another really important directory is our tests directory. It's right next to source, and it has what we're going to look at in a little bit, both invalid and valid data that we can use to validate against our schema. We also have a couple of handy things. If you want to see what questions you answered when you were setting up your project, there's a .copier-answers YAML. It shows you exactly what you answered when you were setting up your project. It has no influence on your project anymore. It's done, but you can at least go back and see what you wrote. And then your just file, this is the file that tells you how to run all those commands. You probably won't have to deal with it, but it's there. And finally, your PyProject.toml. And this is also set up for you, but it shows where all the dependencies that your package manager is going to be using. So those are the most important files here. What we're going to be dealing with mostly today is the schema. Okay, so let's look at the schema in more detail. The top part of this schema is sort of boilerplate LinkML. It includes a resolvable identifier for my schema, a name, a title. I can edit this description to be more descriptive. I would very much encourage it. A license. We also have a series of prefixes because LinkML really wants resolvable identifiers. It's going to identify queries in your schema, and it's going to try to expand them and contract them. So it's important to have sort of like a schema map for your queries here. There's some that come by default. Some like Pato are for the show the Perl of the Pato ontology, etc. We also have imports. I mentioned that at the beginning of our talk, where you can import one LinkML schema into another. This one's pretty important. LinkML types sort of defines what kind of types your attributes can have. So are they strings? Are they integers? Are they dates? Are they queries? Those are all contained in a schema called LinkML types. And then finally, we get to the meat of our schema. We have classes and we have slots. I'll get into what those are. And we have enumerations. So that's sort of the anatomy of a LinkML schema. And now let's get into actually authoring the model. And if you're still having trouble setting up your environment, I would really encourage you to take the shortcut and just clone our repo, and you can follow along from there. So what do I mean by a schema in LinkML? A schema really defines the structure and semantics of our data model. It's really the top level specification. It declares what exists as things or classes, what attributes or properties they have. Those in LinkML are called slots, and what sort of control we have over the value of a slot. And that's what we call enumerations or permissible values of an enumeration. Those define how we control what goes into slots. And these all relate to each other. LinkML elements are actually in a schema, a LinkML schema themselves, and you can kind of see it here on the left. A class is an entity or concept in the model. You have the ability to inherit the attributes of a class from a parent in LinkML, and you can also specify what makes up that class, what defines it, what are its properties or its attributes. And you can also impose constraints on those slots for a particular class or subclass, depending on your modeling needs. And then I keep saying slot. It's analogous to a column in a spreadsheet or an attribute on a JSON schema. It can even be a relationship between two classes in LinkML. It's kind of analogous to an RDF property. We can define the range, what kind of value is allowed there, the cardinality, whether you have one of these particular attributes or many of them on a particular thing, whether or not that thing is whether or not that attribute of a thing is required for every instance of that thing, or whether it's optional, and then which classes can use it or not. Enumeration is another sort of big word, but it just means we can kind of think of it as a controlled vocabulary. It's sort of like a finite set of permissible values for a slot. And you can they can be lists, they can be linked to ontology terms, they can be expanded against an external ontology. I'll mention a tool that does that for you, but I won't go into how you run it. You'll have to try that on your own. We can also add, because of LinkML, we can add lots of annotations, like I showed in the beginning, to those particular permissible values to declare their meaning. Okay, so back to a class. Let's actually do some of this. And I wrote down, when I was making this tutorial, just some best practices that I keep in my head when I'm defining a class. I think a lot of people ask me two things when I'm modeling for them. First, they ask me, how do I decide whether something's a class or a slot? And they ask me, how do I decide which ontologies to use? And those are two really hard questions, right? So we tried to write down some of the things that lead us to make a class if we've been doing this for a long time. And the first thing is, like, when you're trying to define a class or an object or a table, you want to model things and not values. So if I ask myself, would I have multiple examples of this kind of thing in my data, then it's probably a class. if I don't have multiple distinct example of this kind of thing or concrete instantiation of an object, then it's probably a slot. And some best practices along that line, we'll get into it. Just really using the meta model components like description, aliases, comments, to really define what that thing is for someone who might not understand what it is. And that's to keep those very, very human readable, shy away from, intense logical definitions, but also follow the kind of examples we have in the ontology world of making a good description or good definitions. And in general, I tend to use ontologies for semantics and meanings and LinkML for the shape of the data. I don't know if that's going to help, but let's do some examples. So in our shared Google Drive, there is this great quote unquote schema from Leo Baumgart that describes just a subsample of his schema that we're developing with him right now. It is just a spreadsheet, and I'm going to use that in my explanations to sort of show how I would turn this into classes and slots. And it's a very helpful schema in that I'm really only defining one class. And it's the class, the thing that I'm going to have lots and lots of examples of is the concept of a tissue sample. So Leo is taking tissue samples of a particular plant at different parts of the plant and recording them and freezing them and doing genomics on them. And so I know that out of all of these things, I'm going to have one class, which is plant tissue sample. Oops. And one thing I'm going to do here is, to make it easier on myself, is don't do this. Let's see. Source schema. And then we've got our LinkML tutorial YAML, and I'm going to copy that into source schema just to make it easier on myself to show you what we're doing here on the fly. Okay. So ta-da, now we have a schema that looks more like the one you can get when you check out. And the first thing I'm going to do is make a plant tissue sample class. And I'm going to give it a good description. In this case, I'm able to use it directly from Leo's spreadsheet, but I'm going to say that plant tissue sample includes the collection of taxonomic and environmental information. And the first thing you can see here is I'm going to, just like if I was making a spreadsheet, I'm going to start putting down the columns that I think are in my data set. And I'm just going to really copy them directly from what Leo has given me, right? So I might have an identifier that tells me what this particular sample is. I have a container that I want to record on, and we'll get to it in a minute, but Leo says that maybe this could be one of two values. It can be a tube or a plate. So we'll get to how we specify that in a minute. We have the location on a plate, and probably we're not going to have a location on the plate if we don't have plate recorded in sample container. And so that's something else we can define in LinkML, the strain or cultivar, the isolate. I'm just listing these as columns in a spreadsheet. That's sort of the first thing to do. Okay, so let's get there. And now let's talk a little bit about how I can add detail to this, right? We already sort of talked about the description. If I knew that, people in my lab were calling this something else besides a plant tissue sample, I could easily list the aliases for that. And maybe it's just tissue sample, right? Or maybe it's something else like biosample, right? I can list those as aliases as a clue to the people in my lab or the people in my group that this is actually what we're now calling it, their equivalent. I can also add mappings, which is really nice. So if I added, and this is one of the places that LinkML tries to collaborate with external ontologies. And what I would do as a modeler is I would go to ontology lookup service. It's just my own workflow. You might have your own. You might look at BioPortal or other kinds of lookup services here. And I would start querying for the names of my things. And I would just say, do you have something called plant tissue sample already? Right. And maybe not immediately, right? Biological sample preservation procedure, tissue tumor sample, none of those look right. What about just plain tissue sample? Maybe I could find sort of like a subclass. Search. Right, and in NCIT, I see tissue sample. I might click on that and read the definition: a piece of tissue removed from an organism for examination. That sounds an awful lot like what I'm talking about. And I know I want to make a mapping here. I would say that probably this tissue sample definition is a little less, it's a little more broad than what I'm talking about. It doesn't mention plants here at all. So instead of an exact mapping, I might make a broad mapping here. I might say that my definition of a plant tissue sample is less broad than, is more specific, I should say, than this particular NCIT ID. But I could certainly add that here in my LinkML schema easily. Okay, so that's what a mapping is. I'll show you how that works in a minute. We sort of talked about class URI already in the tutorial, but if I wanted to, in my OWL serialization of this model, if I wanted to actually say that the definition of plant tissue sample shouldn't come from me, that its IRI is really an external ontology identifier. If instead of plant tissue sample, I literally had tissue sample in my model, I could use that NCIT identifier here and say that I want the definition of my class to come from NCIT. I don't think we have that here. Of course, if I was doing my due diligence, I would spend more time with the ontology lookup service, but I don't think we have that here, so I'm not going to specify the class URI, but it is available to you. And let's see, let's go on. So another thing you can do in LinkML is you can say, well, you know, I'm a lab that collects plant tissue samples, but the people right next to me collect tumor samples, right? And we're all collecting sample data. We all have plates and wells, and we all have tubes, and these are things we can reuse. So I can also, in my model, create a more generic class called sample, right? And spoiler alert, I have another LLM enabled in my IDE to help me autocomplete some of this work for me. It knows a lot about LinkML. It knows the syntax of LinkML, so it's much easier for me to do these things with that on. So it's just going to say it's another kind of example of a sample, and what I'm going to do in plant tissue sample is just relate them together with a simple ISA. So now I'm saying everything that applies to sample up here also applies to plant tissue sample, and I might, you know, do some rearranging as a modeler. I might say, well, all samples must have IDs. So I'm going to move ID to the top level here. And then I know that because I've established this ISA relationship to my parent class, just like I would in ontology, everything applies from that parent class to my child class. So even though I don't specify identifier here in the slots, I'm getting it for free with LinkML from that parent relationship. All right.
There's a question in the chat.
Oh, yeah. Go ahead.
Here, I think might be worth answering. They asked, are the attributes in the LinkML controlled? For example, exact mappings and broad mappings, or you can, chat's going crazy, sorry. Or you can define whatever terms you want.
No, Kevin's exactly right. LinkML defines a language that you use for all the things in orange on my screen now, except for the names here. The names I can determine myself. But ISA, broad mappings, aliases, description, those are all meta model components in the LinkML model itself. And I would really encourage you, if you are going to be doing a lot of modeling in LinkML, to attach the LinkML meta model to your IDE. Then a lot of this stuff is sort of auto-completed for you. But maybe, Kevin, you can put in the chat a link to the meta model so folks can see what the terms are available to us. And it's a really good question because, you know, after this tutorial, you might want to go spend some time looking at existing models because a lot of existing models do more complex things with LinkML than I'm doing here. And one really good place to find models is the LinkML registry. I'll put that in the chat. You can look up all sorts of different kinds of work that uses LinkML to describe their schema. And, you know, you could go to this, and I've talked about the National Microbiome Data Collaborative schema before. You can go here and sort of see how they use the the LinkML modeling language, etc. You can see the YAML that they have down here at the bottom. Okay, so, and then Sue says, in looking up the term, I would have opened the tissue sample to check the child terms to make sure there wasn't a closer match. Indeed. So in OLS, very good point, Sue. I probably should have looked a little bit further down under tissue sample to see if there was anything about plants. And, you know, I don't know, it looks pretty human to me. Maybe frozen or fresh tissue, right? So I think these are the things that maybe start to confuse users just a little bit, or confuse me a little bit. Like, why would you separate frozen and fresh here? Maybe there's a reason for that, but like, couldn't you have fresh plants? I don't know. So maybe spend some more time in the ontology. It's never a bad idea. Right, okay. And it looks like Deepak got Anis, I hope I'm pronouncing your name right, question answered. All right, so moving on, let's see. There's another language tool in LinkML called a mixin. This is what we use to specify a multi-parent hierarchy of classes. You can have multi-parent inheritance in LinkML. I'm not going to go into it today. I would say that it's probably a pattern you want to avoid when you're making your first model. Try to just make a single inheritance pattern for your classes. You probably only need mixins if you're making a very hierarchical model that's has lots of different parentage and stuff. They're not useful. I use them in another flagship project that we have called BioLink Schema, which Deepak helped create. So they are useful, but just avoid them if you're a newbie, I would say. And then, okay, so let's dive into what we can do with slots here. So we've defined our class. We know that the class has several different slots, but what does it mean to have a sample container? And in LinkML, we kind of define slots as another kind of reusable component. So let's just look really quickly at the best practices I put together for slots. So, if a class defines a thing, then you use the slots to describe that thing, or you can use them to connect things. And so if you can ask yourself, does this X have a Y? Then the Y is probably a slot. And if you start finding yourself needing to define subcomponents of that Y, it's probably better to model that Y as a class. So for example, if you had the slot height and you put what we call a range or a definition of type on that height of a float, that's probably a slot, right? We only have one kind of thing we can put in there. But if you want to define something called a measurement, which has not only the float, right, the unit, but it also has maybe the value of that, and it has other kinds of things associated with it, you're probably going to make that into a class and relate it to your main class with a slot that is a relationship. Another thing we ask ourselves is, could multiple things share this property? And if so, in LinkML, I want to define that slot in a reusable way. And what I mean by that is, down here in our slots section of our model, we can see that I kind of took the approach of defining all of our attributes, all of our columns in this spreadsheet separately from their classes, so I can reuse them. Like, I know every class in my schema, whether it be a generic class called sample, or these plant tissue samples, or maybe I have a tumor tissue sample, all of them need to have an identifier. And so I'm going to define ID separately from a class, and I'm going to give it its own metadata. In this case, I'm going to use a special reserved word in LinkML called identifier. That means that it's basically defining that an ID is required every time it's used and that it's unique. And I'm going to tell that this identifier is an integer. I specify that with the range attribute of the ID. And importantly, all of that aside, give it a description, right? So somebody knows when they're coming along what it means to use that slot. I can do that for all of the other kinds of slots in our model too. And remember at the top, I said, it looks like Leo wants us to use a sample container with two possible values. It can either be a container that is a tube, or it can be a plate. And so that right there, as a modeler, clues me into making this range something other than a string. I don't want to be able to put in there that I collected it in a paper bag, right? I want it to only have those two values. So if somebody's entering a sample, they can only choose plate or tube. And that's where I would start making the range of this sample container slot an enumeration. And I specify that just by specifying the name in my model of what the enumeration name is in that range slot. And if I scroll back up here to the enumeration section of my LinkML model, I can see that we do have that same class or that same enumeration listed in our model with 2 permissible values. And this is how you specify it in LinkML. You can say, I have 2 permissible values, a tube and a plate. Again, I can add metadata to every single one of those permissible values. I would highly encourage you to do that. You can even add stuff to your enumeration that you added to your slot. So if I have an exact mapping for this particular permissible value, never trust the IDE to give you an identifier. This is probably not an exact mapping to tube. So, you know, take it with a grain of salt, but you can add your own, right? You could have, maybe there's a BioLink model tube as well. You can add a mapping there to that permissible value. And we'll get into that in a little bit more detail in a minute. Okay, so, right, it's fine to use terms from a local ontology itself in the YAML file. How does the YAML validate the terms? It's a very good question. So if I wanted to, instead of saying tube or plate, if I instead wanted to say, you know, and let's see, OB 0115, right? I could use that as an ontology term itself. There are more advanced usages. So I'm just going to scroll down really quick. Another slot in our model is NCBI taxon identifier. And LinkML has a syntax for using the entirety of an ontology. It also has syntax for using a subset of an ontology, and it has syntax for using one branch of an ontology plus another branch of an ontology. It's all kind of advanced syntax. It's documented on the slides. You can link to it. But here's one example of that. So if I'm saying I want to validate against any term in NCBI taxon for the value of the parameter that uses NCBI taxon enumeration, I'm going to say that this enumeration is reachable from an ontology, which is NCBI taxon. And then I'm going to use code in my building of this model to expand NCBI taxon to all its terms and provide a generated file of those terms for me to use in my enumeration. And I'll show you how to do that in a minute. You can also, what I was saying too, is you can use just bits of an ontology in your enumeration. So this syntax reachable from, again, the source ontology for our tissue type enumeration is the plant ontology. And I'm saying that the source node for that extraction of a subset from an ontology is this particular term, which I believe is plant anatomical entity, but check me to be sure. And I'm saying don't include plant anatomical entity in my subset that I'm extracting, and only get me the subclasses of that term. So I hope that syntax makes sense if we don't exactly get to how you would extract those with code, but there is a tool to do this. And it will validate when you extract those terms using that tool. Okay, let me make sure I got through all of the other things. All right, so another thing we might want to do is validate that if we do have a slot in or a column in our spreadsheet or a column in our table that whose range is just a string, it's just a text string, it could be any text string, we might want to confirm that that text string is of a certain type. So in Leo schema, the plate location, find it really quickly here. Hopefully I have it. Yes, plate location. It's the well, right? And it sort of looks like this. And he gives us a thing that says, for partial plates, fill by columns, leave blank if sample will shipped in a tube. So all of this information we can translate into some sort of regular expression to confirm that it is the thing that someone fills in as a plate location is of type B1, for example. It is an actual valid plate identifier. Another thing you can do here is if you had, here's another example of that constraining the ploidy of the particular sample to an enumeration and making some mappings to other definitions of ploidy from the ontology lookup service. Again, you can see that there's many different ontologies that define ploidy. Putting these exact mappings here is a huge step in the right direction of being able to say, actually, my definition maps to those definitions. But let's say you collected this over multiple different times and you wanted to have multiple values of the date collection date. I don't know why you would want to do that, but I don't think I actually filled in an example here, so I'm just going to make one. In LinkML, you can say that the value of that slot is a list. And the way you say the value of that slot is a list of values is by specifying this multi-valued designator. If you don't have multi-valued on your slot, it's just going to be single valued. That's the default. But you could also, if you wanted to be very precise, you could say false here, right? So you only have one value. All right, so
There's a
oh, yeah.
question in the chat, Sarah. Is it possible to validate the prefix URLs at the top of the LinkML file before trying to expand value sets from an ontology?
Yeah, in fact, if I try to use an ontology term in my LinkML schema and I haven't defined the prefix of that ontology term up here, it will throw an error. So you're exactly right. You do need to specify the prefixes of your ontology terms you use ahead of time in the prefixes collection. That's exactly right. Okay, right. And so I think one other thing I wanted to mention, I probably have already said it, so I'll go fairly quickly. If you have something like this ploidy enumeration and you have your permissible values in it, these are the only ones that you want the user to choose from, but you know that they don't want to see ontology terms. It's too difficult for them. You can use just plain old English, but also add the LinkML annotation that the meaning of that term that you've rewritten for their ease of use is actually the literal Pato string itself. So that's sort of in LinkML how you would make it easy for your users, but also include the exact mapping or mapping to Pato. Okay, let me hurry up. I think I'm getting a little behind. Yeah, okay, so here's what I wanted to show you in terms of expanding those enumerations that we use with this reachable from syntax, using a source ontology, using a source set of nodes, and defining the kinds of relationships we want to extract from that ontology. I will point you to this particular slide and this particular documentation from LinkML and this particular tool called VS-Kit. And what it's going to do is it's going to take your schema and it's going to expand that reachable from directive into a set of terms you can use. So I encourage you to try that. All right, there are other useful modeling language constraints in LinkML that we probably don't have time to go through today, but you can do other things. Like if I had, it's easiest just to use examples to see this. If I had a gene ID, a gene class, like a gene is a thing and it had an ID in my model, and I know that I'm going to need it to have a query or an identifier of a certain type, but I don't want to be prescriptive about what kind of query is acceptable. I don't want to be as restrictive as I could be by making a pattern constraint that said it had to start with HGNC, or I'm going to make it, make it be an enumerated list that I expand of all of the NCBI gene IDs. If I didn't want to be that prescriptive, I could just use this ID. I could use this ID prefixes directive to kind of list the different kinds of schema elements, the different kinds of namespaces that were valid as identifiers for this gene ID. We use that in the NCATS data translator to help us resolve identifier spaces from different knowledge graphs to use a similar namespace overall. So that's how we do that in NCATS data translator. It's valid to use any one of these namespaces, but we prioritize them in order. You can also redefine in some ways a slot that you've defined externally so that you can use it again. You can redefine it in the context of a particular class. So if I had an NCBI taxon ID and I wanted to use that to describe the taxon I got a gene from, or the taxon I got a sample from, but in my plant tissue sample, I really wanted to make sure that was required, and maybe it's not required for this other use of NCBI taxon ID, I could use a slot usage directive to change the definition of that slot just for this class. There's a discussion here to be had about keeping your schema monotonic, which means you don't want to redefine something lower down that is less specific than something up higher that you've defined. But there's a couple of really great blog posts on that, and I will let you catch up on that on your own. So I think I'm behind. I'm sorry. That's why I'm rushing here a little bit. If you want to get the schema that I've been showing you, you can always check out our tutorial. And I want to show you just really quickly before we take a short break, how we generate, you've kind of already seen it, but how we generate those different serializations. And when you did just set up on your model, it actually generated a lot of the serializations for us already. So if I go back into my project structure here, I can see that just setup that we ran generated our schema in all of these different serializations for us. I will tell you just off the cuff that these are customizable. You don't need to generate all of these different serializations if you don't want them. If your project only cares about JSON schema, you can just generate the JSON schema. You don't have to generate everything else, but that's customizable, all within our documentation on how to do that. But if I also just want to run one particular serialization, I can do that too. So let me show you how to run just the Pydantic serialization of our model. So I'm taking the YAML file I made and I'm turning it into Pydantic data classes, which are a form of Python data classes that a lot of people use in applications to help constrain the code that works on a model. So I'm telling UV, there. Let's just do this. I think I have a typo. Let me just fix that really quick in the slide. Oh, I forgot it. See, always copy and paste everything, Sierra. All right. So now, oh, is abstract. Yeah. So again, watch out for your pesky AI doing things that it's not supposed to. So it added an is. That's not part of the syntax of LinkML. So now what it's done is it's run the generator that takes our YAML file and it turns it into Pydantic data classes. So let's just look at that really quick. You can see the syntax looks a little different. It no longer looks like YAML, right? But it does have, but it is, if you were a Pydantic expert, this is exactly what you'd want to see. You'd want to see all of your classes. Let's get past the metadata. There's our ploidy enumeration that we were talking about, our sample, which is abstract, our plant tissue sample, which has all of its different slots on it, but just in different syntax. So that's sort of how we generate data with, generate serializations of our model with LinkML. All right, I think we should take a 5-minute break and we'll come back and do validation. Just give me a second to get a drink of water, and why don't we return at exactly 9:30. Does that sound good to everyone? We will do that. And I'm going to turn off my camera and just get a drink of water, and then we'll come back to do validation in 5 minutes. Okay, coming back. Let's start sharing a few things again. I think the first I want to share is another one of our questions, just to get folks back into it. And maybe start some discussion here at the end. But what's the hardest part of maintaining data consistency across your projects? Could it be that, we're not all sharing the same schema? That seems like an easy answer. Could it be that, you're not validating the data against a schema? Is it that you have multiple schemas that you're trying to map between? Those are kinds of things that come to mind here, but I'd like to hear your response. Thank you, Sarah, again, for putting the Slido links in the chat. That's awesome. Diversity, absolutely. You have lots of people collecting data in different ways, different opinions. Yeah, we're all very opinionated in this domain, aren't we? That's a good thing though, right? Agreeing on meaning. Yep. I think that's very applicable to ontology development or schema development, is that your definitions are incredibly important and people need to agree on them. And that takes time and it takes effort and it takes humility and it takes, talent, all sorts of stuff. It's a really good one. Okay. And I definitely agree. And I think that's something we face in LinkML too. So how do I get rid of this one? Let's see if I can just do that. All right. No more Slido. So now we're on to validation. And what I did, because we were sort of messing around with the schema a little bit, I went ahead and cloned in the break our repository. So this is a clone of that LinkML project, LinkML tutorial 2025. I'll put the link back in the chat. If people want to keep theirs going, that's great. If you want to clone, that's great. It's just easier for the tutorial if I clone. All right. And let's see, where are we? We're on validation. Okay, so we've got a schema. We know people are going to be entering data to our schema. How do we validate that the data is correct? And can I do that out of the box with LinkML? And the answer is yes, you can do that out of the box with LinkML. And in fact, LinkML likes to champion examples for design. I think one of the problems that we identified in our Slido just now was that keeping people in agreement on the understanding of a particular set of elements in a schema is a challenge. And I think with a great leadership from Chris, we've discovered that, examples really go a long way. So you can say something very broadly in a description, but if you have an example of that, it makes it a lot easier. So LinkML validate is a command you can run on your schema file, and any data that you have, you can run that data as JSON. You can run that data as YAML. Those are the two that we primarily work with. And if you look at the repository, we've sort of seeded a couple of example data files for us to work with. And am I sharing? I am not sharing my, let's see if I can share my Python as well as these. Okay, so we are back inside of my Python integrative development environment. Hopefully you can see that. I think I shared it correctly. Make sure in chat. Okay, great. All right, so you're seeing this. So inside of our repository, there's this test directory that I pointed out at the beginning of examining what happened when we made this template out of the copier template. In the test directory, there's a data directory, and in that data directory, you'll have a set of invalid data and a set of valid data. And this valid data is exactly reflected on my slide here. It's in YAML format. It conforms to our schema. It's a very happy little file, right? It has all the things that are required. It has all of the pattern matches that we declared in the schema for particular slot values. It has the enumerated values that we need in our schema. So let's look at that again. Some of the things maybe to point out are, this ploidy slot is using one of our permissible values. The collection date is in datetime format. One of our, our elevation in meters is just an integer. I remember at the beginning, I sort of talked about those 3 environmental terms that we use in NMDC. that are specified by mix S to be envo terms. Those are all specified here with envo terms. So when we run, LinkML run, LinkML, sorry, UV run LinkML validate. Yeah, let me just do it so we can see that it runs for real. What I'm telling it to do here with this command is I'm saying run LinkML validate on my schema. That's the YAML file we've been looking at. I'm trying to validate against this class, plant tissue sample, right? That's our main class that we're trying to validate against, and use this data file, plant tissue sample 001-YAML. And I'm going to run that, and it's going to convert our schema from LinkML YAML into JSON schema because I haven't specified any plugins or anything specific about LinkML validate. So it's just going to try with JSON schema. It converts that into JSON schema. It looks for the plant tissue sample object in the JSON schema, and it compares that test data with the schema, and we get a no issues found. So it's a great way to test whether or not your definitions in the schema match what people think of in terms of test data. And let's look at what happens when that's a valid one, excuse me. I think that's, yeah. So we have another little tiny mistake in our slides. Don't mind me. We actually want to be looking at an invalid file here. It's right here. So we'll correct that in the slides. But let me just pull up what an invalid data type looks like. So I think, let's see. So this one we're doing missing required. Okay, so missing required YAML file in the invalid directory of our data directory of our tests. And it's going to have some missing components. It's going to be missing, I didn't even write it down. Well, poo for live demos. It's going to be missing a lot of our required fields. And so let's try to run that and see if I do run it, whether or not this is correct here. Let's just run it. Same sort of parameters, run validate on my schema against the plant tissue sample class, and use the missing required YAML to test that. And what it's going to report out to us is that the strain variety cultivar is a required property, so that's an error. NCBI taxonomy ID is required, an error, and I'm also missing tissue. So back here, let me just look at it here. That missing required, you can see I don't have enough parameters in my YAML instance to validate. The same thing you can do with patterns. I'll just show the slides now. In the same test data invalid directory, we have a plant tissue sample with the pattern violation. So look at plate location and sample size. Sample size is supposed to have a space between the float here and the units. And the plate location, I believe, has to be something like B1. I don't know if Z99, maybe that's just not a plate value. And so I run it, and what we have is, Z99 does not match this regular expression. 0.45 grams does not match this regular expression, so it's going to give me an error. And this seems pretty obvious, like I'm literally making the data and I know it's wrong already, right? But if you're doing a big schema with lots of different people and you want to keep your schema consistent and you want to keep it understandable by many people on the team, having these example files both increases understanding, and it also allows you to run automatic continuous integration, continuous deployment tests on your schema. So that if somebody changes the definition of sample size, for example, to exclude that space here, then this is going to validate, and your test is going to fail because we've intentionally made invalid data. And if it passes, then that's actually a failure. Do you understand? It's kind of like opposite of what you would think. Same with your valid data. If you have data that is valid against your schema, someone changes the definition of schema, suddenly your data is invalid, it fails your test, and they know downstream in whatever tool is being used to enter data into your database, for example, they know that they need to make a change to their software as well. So it's a really great educational tool to be able to run that. Same thing here. It's going to validate enumeration values. So this plant tissue sample bad range YAML has a couple of examples in it. That one is it's validating that the box is not in tube or plate. That was our container enumeration that only has tube and plate in its enumerated values. So box isn't one of that. It's going to fail. Same with octoploid. It's not one of our ploidy and here very deep is not of type number. So it's going to validate those ranges as well. Chat. Yeah, it seems like I need to install Gen Project before running just Gen Project. Interesting. Let me try running. I don't think you should have to. Yeah, that I think just Gen Project should be running as part of the setup. I'm not really sure why you would get that. That's too bad. Maybe try checking out from cloning right now, and we can reach out. We can work on that in the chat. Another question is, I seem to be using YAML files as test data. Why not use a spreadsheet or CSV with more common? I think that's true. I think for the purposes of the demonstration, it's the easiest for me to do, but you can use different kinds of data for that as well. I would encourage you to try it. Another really common one is to have an example file with more than just one particular instance, right? You probably want more than one here, and that's doable as well. You can put more than one example in your example data file. Okay, so I went over that really quickly. I think it's a really important point. I think you can do a lot more with validation than I've had time for to show you in the tutorial. I think we have some pretty good documentation on validation. You can do more command line configuration with validation than I've showed you. I also mentioned a couple times now that you can write plugins to the validation to validate your particular schema beyond what we do as a default in LinkML. I've put a couple of repos here that have custom plugin validators, and you can go explore those as well. I would encourage you to do so if you're really interested in this. All right. Yeah, okay, I agree, Corey. Catching up, again, check it out. And I think I get to stop talking for a little bit, and maybe Kevin wouldn't mind taking over the screen share and talk about schema introspection. It's a really interesting topic, part of LinkML.
Yes, let me get I'm following along quite enough to be in presenter view yet. So let me get my window into presenter view.
Great job, Sierra, so far. This has been great.
Absolutely. Okay. So we saw we had a pretty advanced audience, and so I kind of wanted to get into the weeds a little bit on some of the tooling for working with LinkML schemas that that we use to build LinkML tools, but that can be very useful for working with your schemas otherwise, even just as a user of LinkML. And I find myself doing that a lot, sort of because I have the background of working on, you know, the sort of pedantic generator and things like that, where we sort of iterate through the schema, and we iterate through classes, and we iterate through the slots on the classes, and sort of like that's, you know, and produce the sort of Python equivalent to a LinkML class, or the Python equivalent to a LinkML slot. Sometimes there's handy reasons to get into that, and so I'm going to cover two sort of pieces of that: the schema view, the introspection tool, which I think is sort of the most likely to be useful, which lets you sort of read the YAML in the schema, but sort of also computes over it to sort of give the right answers to things, and then a little bit on constructing a schema with Schema Builder. And this one is an experiment that is kind of relevant to me because I have a Monarch app that uses a schema that is built from BioLink model, but is kind of flatter and simpler. And I built it by hand, and I wish I had built it programmatically. So I sort of took this as an opportunity to try what happens if I sort of pull part of BioLink model and pull in some value sets and combine some things. And I stayed up a little bit too late last night trying to get it to work, and it's mostly works. So schema introspection with schema view, you know, LinkML is YAML, and you can just read YAML, but sometimes the YAML is huge, and that can be sort of challenging depending on the question you want to ask. And so if the question you want to ask is like, you know, we had some questions today about the difference between ISA and broad match. And I don't actually look at the LinkML meta model that often, but it's pretty great to go and look at it and read, like, there's a definition for what ISA means, and there's a definition for what broad match means. And it ties, ties back to ontology terms and all that. And you can sort of find that when you read the YAML. But, if you, you're using programmatically, you can get the list of classes with like these, like YQ is a command line tool that lets you sort of parse and query YAML files. So you can use YQ and you can get like the names of all the classes. But if you wanted to get all of the slots, properties that are defined for one of your classes, it will only tell you what's directly defined. And so if you do that in the BioLink model, you just get two fields, symbol and XREF properties. And like, you probably assume that a gene has some other things like an ID maybe, or a name. And so with schema view, you can load up the model file and get the slots of the gene, and it will follow the inheritance, because gene inherits from it goes up the inheritance tree to sort of named thing, the sort of top of all the nodes in BioLink. And so, fields like ID are defined way up high, and, a name, and then others are sort of like defined a little lower. Maybe biological entities have synonym and that sort of thing. Full name must be defined a little bit higher up. But this gets you the sort of computed list of properties that are available for a gene, and it's that computing that's really important. And so schema view, it loads, it takes care of the imports for you, and navigates class hierarchies and computes induced slots. And so there's some handy stuff for loading the schema. You can go from a local file, just simply giving the path. You can go from a URL, and it's very cool that it just works. You don't have to do requests or do anything else. And then you can also, and this is a pattern that's really common, and it's why the schema in our examples and in a template, the schema is not the top. It's sort of down in the Python, because then you can import a schema as a Python dependency, and you import to a specific version, and you can then read the schema view out of your Python environment. You don't have to actually know specifically where that file is. You get it from your Python environment. You've declared a certain version. You get that. And there is one extra thing, way to do this that I didn't document, because it there's a function called package schema view that will read a schema by just giving it a package name, but it's dependent on the schema being in just the right place. And I think BioLink model is sort of the great grandmother of LinkML schemas, and so it doesn't necessarily follow the conventions that were defined later on. So it doesn't work for that. But package schema view is an especially cool thing, because it means you don't have to worry about import lib yourself. Even you can just sort of use a Python package. And so the basics of schema view are that you can list all the classes, the slots, the enumerations. You can get specific classes and sort of thing. You can get specific elements. And importantly, you can work with descendants and ancestors and that sort of thing. You can just navigate it as a hierarchy. And I don't know that I've used class leaves before. I didn't realize that was there, but I thought it was cool to, class roots, leaves, and you can also find the set of classes that are both a leaf and a root. And this kind of thing, I think could be really useful for kind of QC of a big schema. And then I wanted a sort of like example demonstration and to sort of tie schema view back to ontologies, because this is such an ontology centric group and tutorial. So I wanted to extract the sort of broad, narrow, exact mappings between the predicates the BioLink uses, the sort of relationships, the description of the relationships, and RO terms. And these mappings are really important so that BioLink model is connected to the world of ontologies, and you know, we have things, not strings. And so if you want to get the list of all predicates in BioLink, BioLink has this sort of unique to BioLink, maybe sort of way of defining all of the predicate values as they are defined as slots, and they're slots that descend from a particular slot. So everything that is a predicate in BioLink is a descendant of the related to slot. And so this is basically just you can get them. And if you want to get all the mappings from a single slot, here's just sort of a chunk of Python code. And this is also in a notebook in the repository. And I should have probably been brave enough to run it as a notebook, but here as slides, this will give you the sort of set of mappings for a single, and then on the next slide, this is wrapped up with a little bit of pandas, and I just wanted to sort of show this as a demonstration, you know, that you can iterate through all of the mappings you've defined in a schema, and you can produce these triples of an element in BioLink and the kind of match it has to an ontology term, and sort of look up the meaning to the slots. And of course, after I sort of thought of this example and got all excited about it, I remembered that probably there's already a tool in LinkML for generating SESM, which is the sort of the standard for expressing these kinds of mapping associations. And sure enough, there is a gen SESM that you can make part of your sort of LinkML project, and you can generate a proper SESM file of this, and you don't have to write any of this code. But I wanted to include this as an example of ways that you can get in and make use of your schema for some custom problem. And I'd sort of add the time this has come up for me has been like, I'm moving between formats, and I have TSV files, and I have to care about which columns in this TSV are representing multi-valued and which ones aren't. And it just sort of like, it comes up getting things at Neo4j, it comes up getting into Solr, just like it comes up all the time. And so it's sometimes it's just nice to be able to bring your schema open and you iterate through each slot and just know if it's multi-valued or not. And then that's just here, made a nice ASCII art visualization to show that there are 134 narrow matches between BioLink predicates and RO terms, 57 exact and 9 broad. And then the more complex example where you can sort of think of this as, you know, this is inspiration and experimentation. And this was basically like, can I take can I build a new schema without writing any YAML myself that just reuses pieces of other things? And so use Schema Builder to approach it. And Schema Builder uses this nice builder pattern in the Python code where you initiate it, you make your schema, and you can just add classes and slots and enumeration sort of programmatically, which means you could just write out everything you would have written in the YAML as Python code, but like even better, you can have something that you iterate over and you add each piece. And so this is the basics of it are that you can add slots and you get this sort of code completion, and as Sarah said, these are legal packages that are in the copier template. So if you've installed, if you're working from the template, you just will have these Python packages. So this is my made up example that I'm doing a research project where I'm going to have some clinical data and some biolink model style data for disease, drugs, and phenotypes. And I want to make use of LinkML value sets for my enumerations. And so I'm going to load up my schema here. I'm using the biolink model from the package to make a schema view instance. So this is the view, my view into biolink. And then I'm going to make the builder that is the schema I'm going to build. And I'm going to add some prefixes to sort of define the or root the things I'm going to use in this schema. And next up, this is where the trouble is. And so you can see my left out comment there. I've got my little list of biolink classes I'm going to bring in, and I'm going to iterate through each of those classes, and I'm going to grab the slots from those classes, and I'm going to create slots. I'm going to add those slots to the schema, and then I'm going to use them in a class. And the bit that's left out is when you just grab an entry out of an existing schema, it points to other things in the schema. And you can see in the notebook code that I wrestled with a bit of that. And that's sort of like, well, I'm bringing in, disease. And disease has a parent of like disease or phenotypic feature, and it goes up all the way up the tree. I'm doing something simpler. I don't need the whole tree, so I just take out the ISA. But because I'm getting all the class slots, I'm still getting all the slots that are defined above in a flattened way. And then I had to clear out subsets, and then custom types are a little bit of a challenge. But the one thing that I did handle in that code, if you want to look at it, is if a type is an enumeration, I want to bring that whole enumeration over, and so that I get enumerations in the schema that come from biolink, and I can just reuse them. And then I sort of have some RO terms defined just in this dictionary, and then sort of iterate through adding each one of them. And these are sort of like describing my relationships in the schema. So this is sort of this idea that I'm taking some entities from biolink, I'm taking some relationships from RO and defining them in my schema. And then going to be, I built this with Claude, and I sort of prompted it like, hey, go out to value sets. This is our sort of pretend scenario. Find some appropriate enumerations in the value sets repository to match this. And that ended up being education level and blood type, which is fun. And so that sort of brings those enumerations in. And this is sort of a key thing here. The enumeration is present, and then I add a slot whose range is that enumeration. So that says I'm going to have a property, and it's only allowed to have values from this controlled vocabulary. Yeah, sort of built that as a class. And then you can export, and it produces 750 lines of schema YAML, which is amazing to have like written this little bit of Python code and all of a sudden have a schema with 750 lines. And it's got sort of all of this level of detail. And, I didn't have to think about, do I need to, capture the is toxic on a drug, the work, you can take advantage of the thought that's already been put into a pre-existing schema and bring that along. And key to making this work was running LinkML lint to find out, hey, I made some YAML, it's a schema, but it's not internally coherent. It's pointing to things that I didn't bring in, and it's broken. And then this diagram in the background was the YAML generator. So I ran gen YAML on the YAML file that I produced for the schema. And it, if you haven't tried that, it's very cool. It just gives you a URL to a website that renders it. And it's a big long URL that has the sort of all the content in it. And you open that up and you sort of have your diagram. And that is my last slide on this. I didn't have a question slide. I recognize this is probably pretty far in the weeds, but anyone has any questions, you can address them. Although you probably would have thrown them in the chat, so I could hand off to Corey.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and steal the sharing so that I can have control of the slides. Great, there we go. And pop that into slides. Oops, not what I meant to do. There we go. Great. Does everybody see my screen there? Great. All right. So Kevin and Sierra have done an excellent job of talking to us about why do we want to use LinkML? What is LinkML? How do I author a schema? How do I build off of all the amazing work that other people have already done and pull those things into a schema? And I'm going to talk about a tool here that we have called LinkML Map that is sort of about another problem that we often have with data models and with schemas, and that is we often have more than one data model. So we have our data model that maybe our data was collected in, and we have a data model that is maybe how we want to express it on a web page, or we want to combine multiple studies into a single data model, those kind of things. And LinkML Map is really sort of a tool to talk about, like, what does it mean to have two data models and to convert from one data model to another data model. And then there's sort of two pieces to think about there, right? So there's the question of how do we transform between two data models at the data model level, but then also there's the question of how do we transform between two data models at the data level? And so one of the things that LinkML Map does that I think is going to feel like a real departure from how you're used to transforming data is that we just define the transformations declaratively, not procedurally. So usually as a data analyst, I would find myself in the situation of, oh, I've got to combine these two data sets. So for each variable, I'm going to write an ETL for that variable. And, you know, make that sort of in a bespoke way, right? But when we perform these things declaratively, we get some interesting synergies. Also, it makes it more interoperable, but also it makes it more reproducible. So if I create a data transformation of one data set, and then later we decide, oh, we need to change the model just a little bit, I don't have to go through and make sure everything is correct. I can just change the pieces in the model that I know are different, and we can just run it again. So our tutorial goals here is understand what LinkML Map does and how to use it. So as I mentioned, there are two core functions of LinkML Map. So the first is a schema to schema transformation. So that's saying I have a source data model and I have a target data model, and I want to know how to create my target data model from my source data model. And so this can be done in, and I'll show you in the tutorial, this can be done in a way where we simply define the transformation, and then that will actually, LinkML Map will create that target data model for you. So this is map definitions that are written in YAML using LinkML Map, the LinkML Map model as a syntax. And again, this enables consistent transformations between structured models. A good example of this might be like you collected data in phase 1, and now you've collected data in phase 2, and you want to bring your data from phase 1 into phase 2. So you say, oh, well, I already wrote my data model for phase 1, but we made these changes for phase 2. So all I have to do is say, these are the differences in my transformation, and then that transformation can author for you in LinkML Map the new data model for your phase 2 data. So it can also be useful for aligning community schemas. So if you have two different communities that are trying to communicate with one another, the transformation spec can be a way of sort of creating that translation. Similarly, the second part of it is data to data transformation. So obviously, you know, I just talked about, let's say you have two phases of data, and phase 1, you want to convert that data into your new model in phase 2. So after you've written that transformation that transforms your phase 1 schema into your phase 2 schema, you can use the same transformation specification to actually transform the data as well. Some really neat things about it is that we can use different source data. So one of the people in the chat mentioned, you know, why aren't we using spreadsheets or CSVs? And I mentioned briefly in the chat, the reason for that is because as Sierra mentioned at the very beginning of the top, CSVs are data models, but they're not well-defined data models, which makes them hard to compute without a human. So we first need to build a data model around that, and then we can import using the data model that's about that. So importing the source data, usually from YAML, but we're also working on TSV with the mapping spec, and then we output target data that's model compliant to the second target. One of the things that's really nice about doing it this way is, like I said, LinkML's superpower, in my opinion, is validation. So once you've mapped your data in that transformation, you can use LinkML validate to make sure, did it actually work correctly? And then one of the other things I think is really powerful is we're often working in two data models, but we kind of want the data in both directions. And so in that case, data, transformation specifications can be written in a way that they are reversible. Now, they aren't always reversible. Sometimes you do things with your data in a way that's going to make it not reversible by nature. But if you work at it, you can often find a reversible way to do those same transformations. And so you can have that sort of back and forth. So why LinkML Map? I alluded to these already. So it reduces that brittle hand-coded ETL logic, right? So you don't have to have a data analyst go through every single variable, understand that variable by itself. I should rephrase that. You do still sort of have to have that, right? You need to understand your variables. You need to make sure they're mapped properly. However, once you've done it once, you can keep using it in a way that doesn't often happen in our other harmonization projects, but also you can write it in a purely human well, YAML's sort of human readable, but it is human readable. Trust me on this, once you get used to reading it. In a way that, like, reading a Python line is not really tractable for a lot of our data analysts. Now, obviously, many of you are skilled data analysts who do know Python, but I think you'll come to find that when you have something that's really declarative, it's a lot easier to follow. Again, transparent mappings can be version controlled and reversible. So you may have, you know, you did your mapping this way, and then you learned some things, and now you need to do a mapping in a slightly different way. Well, that can be version controlled in a way that's a lot harder when you're talking about bespoke code. Again, so that allows us to have incremental alignments as models evolve. Oh, whoops. And finally, again, we're in the LinkML ecosystem. We get validation, we get support for multiple formats. When you create your data model using LinkML Map, when you have created your target data model, you can output it to Pydantic, you can output it to OWL, whatever it is that I mean, now granted, we're still working on supporting everything that we would love to support in that beautiful diagram that Sierra showed of like all the things. But LinkML has a tool chain that is working to support those things, so you don't have to. So if you want a format that LinkML doesn't have yet, you can reach out to the community. Can you say, this is something that's important to me, and if other people need that too, sometimes you can get that without having to be the one that does all the work. Now, maybe we're going to ask you to do the work, but we're going to certainly help you, and maybe other people will jump in and do the work too. So I'm just going to go through a few core concepts before I jump into the tutorial, which I am going to try to do a live demo. So we'll see how that rolls. But first, source schema. So this is where your data starts. The target schema is where you want your data to end up. Transformer specification is the link between the two. So it's how things align, your class, slot, and value mappings, and how you go from that first data model into the resulting data model. Finally, I'm going to talk about transformation. Transformation is the act of actually doing that. So we're going to transform either your schema from the source to the target or your data from the source to the target. And then finally, validation, which is where we say, like, did it work? Do I have a valid schema at the end of it? Because you shouldn't just trust your tool blindly, right? Like, I think LinkML map is working pretty well, but we can validate it and make sure, yes, we really did produce a schema that's valid like we expected. So briefly, I'm going to walk you through what I'm going to do in the tutorial, and then I'm actually going to run it. So first, we're going to define and load the source schema. We're going to write a mapping specification. Then we'll transform instance data, and then we'll show what the transformed schema looks like. I'll also show you how to use expressions and unit conversions, tabular serialization, so in case you want to go back to some sort of tabular form, and finally reverse transform. If you want to follow along, there is a link right there to run the tutorial yourself. It can be a little bit fussy about the environment though. So if you do try to follow along yourself and you run into problems, a lot of times it's going to be that your Python environment doesn't have all of these things installed. I'd be happy to manage that after the tutorial. I'm afraid there's not going to be the time to manage it while I'm talking. All right, so let me change what I'm sharing here. And we'll see if I can avoid the curse of the live demo. Okay, so what you'll see here is that I have a Jupyter notebook. And that Jupyter notebook is running my kernel that has all of the things in the Python environment. And so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to need to import YAML. Oops. Because obviously we need to read YAML files. And this is intended for Python developers. I think it's pretty clear that we're kind of Python centric in LinkML. But that isn't to say that we can't output to formats that will work in other environments. So the first thing that we're going to do is, as Kevin mentioned, we can use Schema Builder to build ourselves a little schema here. So we're going to go ahead and build that schema using Schema Builder. And here is that sort of test schema that we're going to run on. So it's a very simple schema. It just has family name, given name, age in years, height in centimeters, and it's for our person class. Now we're going to create a transformer object. So this is something that'll seem pretty new to you to start with, and this is our transformer specification. This is written in the LinkML map model for transformation specifications. So what you'll see here is we have individual instead of person, and we're deriving that class individual from person based on these slot derivations, which is that family name is populated from family name, given name from given name, age from age in years. So this is just a rename, and then height from height in centimeters. So let's go ahead and run that. And then let's see what it looks like. Oh, hold on. Let me make sure I ran this too. We're also using this session object, which allows us to, in fact, I'm going to run both of those again, because otherwise I think I'm going to fail, which allows us to manage all of our objects. So let's go ahead and see what our session looks like right now. And that is, here is our transformation mapping. We have person goes to individual, family name to family name, given name to given name, age and years, age, height to height and centimeter. And so now we're going to go ahead and see what it looks like when we transform some data in this transformation. So as you see here, we have the data from the person object here with these values. And now we've created the same structure, but now converted into our individual class that has the renamed values for age and height. So now we're going to go a little bit deeper into, oh, I'm sorry. So what I mentioned before was that we're also deriving a target schema from this. So if I run this now, we didn't author this schema. We didn't build it in Schema Builder. Instead, what happened was we took the session and got the target schema from it. And the target schema was actually derived by LinkML map using the transformation specification and the source schema. And so this would be an example of if we have authored a transformation specification from one data model to a new data model, this actually writes the second data model for us. So this is that sort of like versioning aspect where we can say we started with this data model and we transformed to this data model. But we often want to do more interesting things to our data than to just just rename fields and rename classes. So when we start to do that, we can do things like give it an expression. So let's say that instead of given name and family name, we want to have a name field that combines them both. So what does that look like? Well, so now we're taking those two values and combining them into the name string. Now, this is one of those points where I would point out to you that what we did here isn't strictly reversible. So if we want to reverse this, we would need to do something in order to make that a reversible transformation. Of course, as everyone on this call knows, when we start talking about something like combining names like this, there's a lot more that goes into it. And so doing this is maybe a little bit naive, and reversing it could be really naive as well. So let's see what transforming our data looks like now. So now we get Jane Doe as the full name, and age in months and height in centimeters. And if we go to the target schema, we can again write the full target schema from our schema transformation. One of the things I find really valuable in LinkML map is unit conversions. So as Sierra sort of pointed out early on, one of the things that's important when we define our schemas well is to define how we're measuring things in that schema. So when we have a schema that defines our target units in a useful and computable way, we can use that information. Oh, I'm sorry. We're still. Oh, right. Yeah. So we can use this information. We started with height in centimeters, And we knew that we were in centimeters in this model, and we did a unit conversion to height in meters. And so now we have the height in meters because our data models showed that we went from one unit to another unit and applied the unit conversion. So looking at it again, we see that we've derived the units. Oh, so now we're going to change this to where we're actually deriving the units in the schema, as opposed to here where we derive the units based on the information in the transformation spec. So if you have your target schema, you can use the information in the target schema. But if you're using your transformation spec to create the target schema, then you'll need to make sure that you embed that in your transformation between the two. All right. And finally, one of the last things to go through here is tabular serialization. So a lot of the time, regularly, we have data in our model in like a YAML or something like that. And we want to flatten it down to something that we can output to someone who needs to see the data. And so this is going through and adding our transformation again, but in this transformation, we're going to stringify the aliases part of the object, which is, as you see, a nested object here. And so when we do that, we can allow it to be flattened, and then this could be output to CSV and TSV. And importantly, you can do your flattening however you'd like to. So you set your stringification to say, I want to separate these with whatever separator I'm choosing. And as I mentioned, the last part here is that provided you have defined them correctly, you can also reverse transform, and you can go backwards from the flattened one back into your aliases, because we define this as a delimiter. I'm sorry, a delimiter. And so we know how to go backwards from this transformation. And really that's the like just jumping in and getting our toes just a little bit wet on the edge of LinkML Map. I do want to tell you that LinkML Map can do a lot more than what I just showed you here. I have been really happy with this tool. And now I'm going to share my slides again and go into just a little bit more there. And that is to say, where does LinkML Map fit in with LinkML? So it works with all of the other LinkML tools. So we get the validators, the generators, we get output to a whole bunch of different formats. And so it complements the LinkML runtime and all of the downstream frameworks. It also can serve as an ETL backbone for harmonizing data sets. And in fact, that's the main way that I'm using it. And that is, I have a data model-based ingestion pipeline where we use the LinkML tools to materialize the data model of incoming data, often as CSVs and TSVs, as Sierra alluded to at the beginning of this discussion. We use Schema Automator, one of the tools that she showed, and then use LinkML Map as our ETL pipeline for data ingestion and harmonization. If you're interested in that, I'd be happy to discuss it with you another time, but it's a little out of scope for this tutorial right now. There's also more example notebooks. Tutorial.ipynb in the LinkML Map repository is the core walkthrough that I presented here, but there's also one for derivations, which is more mapping, schema composition for reusing maps, and a data validation notebook as well. And with that, we're on to wrap up and discussion. Feel free to ask questions about what I've presented here, or if you have questions about other work that we did earlier in the talk, yeah, please jump in.
Yeah, that was a great demo of LinkML map query. I really liked it. If you go down a couple of slides, there's also connection
Oh.
information here. You know, if you want to be part of the LinkML development community, we'd love to have you. We have a Slack workspace in the OBO Slack. You can join our channels there. A lot of you are already on that Slack, so it's pretty easy to join our channels. We have a couple of active working groups that are working to develop the tools a little bit more. Corey leads one for LinkML Map. That information is in the chat if you want to join and do some development there or just find out more. And we always are welcoming of pull requests. Again, we're mostly volunteer organization creating this package, and we wouldn't be able to do it without our community supporters. So join us. We'd love to have you. And I think one more slide has all the details in it for joining the community. So if you want to go just one more, Corey, down one more slide. Yeah, you can find a bunch of helpful links here to keep connected. So we'd love to have you join us. Be part of the group. Okay, so in the chat, Corey, you have one comment from Philip, and you've already responded. So hooray!
Yeah, yeah. So I do think that there's maybe room for adding things to LinkML map, like you know, when a slot has that sort of multi-valued adding, but right now you either need to stringify or use an expression. Although now that I'm looking at it, you're doing 2 multi-valued slots to a single multi-valued slot. That may not be implemented yet. I'll have to think about how we should express that. That would be excellent to add to our issues. If you could especially give us some example data to make sure that we're meeting your use case. And these are really valuable pieces of feedback to know how people want to or are using the tool. Yeah, thank you.
I think we're at the end of our official session. We were supposed to be 2.5 hours, and shockingly, we made it. I'm sorry we don't have a whole lot of extra time for questions, but please do reach out to us, and you'll hear from one of us. Keep pestering us. We're, you know, be a squeaky wheel. We love squeaky wheels. I think we all do. We're all very busy, but we really appreciate it, and hope to see you guys on Slack in the coming weeks.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody.